Okay. Thanks very much to both Michaels, and thanks for inviting me to be here. I think it's been a really great series so far, so it's nice to be able to speak. There's been some really interesting papers in the last semester, and it's great for me to have an opportunity to add some of my ideas into the mix in this kind of very stimulating series. So thanks for allowing me to talk and allowing me to reschedule when my voice is just about working. So hopefully it holds out for the half an hour. So I want to talk about a data set, as Michael introduced, that we've recently collected here and that we're working on in terms of CADS, corpus-assisted discourse studies approaches. And particularly, I'm going to look at incivility in this corpus, so uncivil uses of language and discussion. And it's a corpus which I'll describe more a little bit once I get going. But it's a corpus of newsreader comments on climate change articles on The Guardian. And during the end of the last talk, when Michael Kay was advertising my talk, he slightly reprimanded me for my long title, which is fair. So here's an alternative. Why is it that things like "too many people," period, receive things like "oh, do fuck off" in reply? So I'm looking at incivility in this corpus I'm going to describe, and particularly in these newsreader comments. This is what I'm going to try and do with my talk, and I'm going to try hard to keep it to the half hour, so there's time for discussion, which Michael and Michael have asked me to do. So I'm going to review the literature, particularly the literature that looks at climate change communication and takes a CADS, corpus-assisted discourse studies approach. I will make a few assumptions, but I will try to sort of also indicate what that involves at several steps in the talk. And I will then say what I think, or what I judge to be common themes in work that looks at climate change, taking this CADS, corpus-assisted discourse studies approaches, and therefore what are, I wouldn't want to say unexplored, but underexplored opportunities for asking questions on different kinds of data about different kinds of issues that then become prevalent. This will lead me into reviewing a little bit literature on incivility generally, but particularly in relation to newsreader comment context. And then I'm going to describe this corpus, which Michael has characterized earlier on in introducing the talk. And this is perhaps, I hope, one of the big benefits of the talk, or like a contribution, and will be of interest to people who are in the audience, because we hope not too far away to be able to make this corpus available, and we think it's really good. And then I will just about have time to go over some initial findings, and they are quite initial, so that should tie together well. I'm going to talk a little bit about patterns of impolite language that come from an n-grams analysis, a keygrams analysis, I should say. I will describe that a little bit more when I get there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about patterns of verb usage from word frequency list, verb lists for the top verbs that are in this corpus, or a slice of this corpus, and their collocational behavior, the kind of words and patterns that go with them. And this will also lead me into a discussion of something called appraisal theory, a discourse analysis approach, to look at a certain type of stance taking. So I'm going to jump straight into it. CADS, so CADS, corpus-assisted discourse studies and climate change. What has it looked at so far? Well, I would say, and this is a tradition of work that I mostly work within, it's an approach where one works both with corpora to get kind of top-level quantitative views, and then, depending on what one finds there, drills down to detail and uses some discourse analytic approaches, things like transitivity, which was mentioned on the outline slide, things like appraisal theory, which was also mentioned there, and a whole host of other types of discourse analysis framework. Now, much work that has looked into this area, climate change communication, and has taken this CADS approach, I would argue has focused on like traditional institutions, these kind of bricks and mortar institutions. And what I mean by that is places where we can point to a building where the key work happens. So things like parliamentary politics, things like traditional news organizations, things like corporate business. For example, one discourse analytical approach that has explored climate change communication to quite a significant degree, and I don't think it's incidental why it has, is conceptual metaphor theory. So there's a lot of work that has been done in the kind of Lakoff and Johnson approach to look at how climate change is conceptualized. We know it's a hard, severe thing to describe, and we draw on the resources of other source domains, as they are called in the CMT approach, to talk about climate change and try to understand it, discuss it, and so on and so forth. Now, there's been a lot of work that has been done on climate change discourse analysis using a conceptual metaphor theory approach. And some of that work has found, for example, that these source domains are frequently drawn on to talk about and understand and comprehend climate change. So conflict, illness, journeying, and also religion. And there are some suggestions from people like Woods et al. That religion typically is drawn on as a source domain to describe climate change when one is writing from a climate skeptic position. But this work has been done on these kind of traditional bricks and mortar institutions. A lot of it has been focused on traditional news, so things like The Guardian, like the Daily Mail, sometimes broadcast media, and then some work like mine and John, which I provide a citation to here, looks at it in a more parliamentary political context, but still kind of bricks and mortar institutions. Now, a number of scholars, Maxwell Boykoff and Arian Stibbe being two obvious examples, have criticized that there's so much predominant focus and framing around these kind of traditional institutions and how they talk about climate change, and that this naturalizes and reifies these kind of neoliberal ways of thinking. So in terms of conflict, that there are kind of two sides in competition. When you look at that in detail, it's often us fighting with climate change as if it is our enemy somehow. And they would say, Boykoff and Stibbe and others, that only looking at these kind of traditional organizations and how they frame things in typically neoliberal and hegemonic ways is problematic to not having other ways of understanding and conceptualizing climate change and its various parts. Some more recent work in the CADS, again, I'm limiting my literature review here really to a sort of work that happens in a CADS, corpus-assisted discourse studies tradition, has begun to focus on more grassroots organizations. So for example, and it's just a for example, Cunningham et al. Have recently compared the language of politicians in the Houses of Parliament in the UK with the language of activists when they're talking about climate change. And they know that there are some discourses around immediacy and social justice in the latter, so in the language of activists, whereas, perhaps unsurprisingly, discourses of the economy and finance prevail in a parliamentary political context. So they've looked at, and others have looked at activists who've received more recent attention, media-wise, academic research-wise. But one thing that has gone not unnoticed or unexplored, but again, I would say underexplored, are groups that are harder to define and don't really have a label, and who often then come into contact in digital spaces. And after all, we live in a world where, as is illustrated by what we're doing right now, the digital is increasingly prominent, salient, omnipresent in our everyday lives, given that we live in an increasingly interconnected and globalized world. There has been work that's looked here. So Kateko et al.'s study on online newsreader comments, the same kind of genre that I'm going to talk about today, in relation to the University of East Anglia ClimateGate story, is an example of work that takes a kind of CADS approach and looks at how climate change is represented there. The focus was on this ClimateGate case, which I'm sure most of you know and remember, where newsreader commenters on the Mail Online, so the Daily Mail's website, were talking and constructing the science around climate change science as being phony, false, bad, and that this University of East Anglia ClimateGate story was a case in point. Sheshti Floatum and colleagues' works on the representations of the future in blogs about climate change is another example of work that has been done in a CADS approach, looking at digital spaces and looking at groups that are maybe not quite as easy to pin a label on. And their work identifies kind of 9 central meanings that are there in how bloggers talk about climate change and represent the future. And they represent both risks and opportunities to individuals and to businesses in how they construct the future in relation to discussing climate change in blogs. Now, so that's a quick sort of like extremely snapshot view of CAD's work done on climate change. I'm going to skip, as I suggested in my introduction, to now sort of switch and think about work that has been done on incivility generally, and a little bit in relation to climate change, which I would argue doesn't really happen in the CAD's approach, but it could, and maybe it should. So it's a growing area of research that what happens in terms of the digital spaces and incivility is gaining increasing attention as we do more and more of our daily activities online and in digital spaces. And there's something of a mismatch, or potentially at least a mismatch, between studies that ask people to self-report their experiences with, maybe firsthand, maybe themselves individually, and empirical investigations of the occurrence of incivility online. So these kind of self-reported studies, surveys that ask people about firsthand experiences, often return results like this, that 40 to 50% of people say they experience uncivil behavior in an online context. For example, a fairly recent study from 2022 by Pew Research Center focused on teenagers, as these studies often are, as I guess, potentially vulnerable groups who are online, found that 46% of them had claimed that they were cyberbullied. And Pew offered a kind of anchoring definition according to 6 behaviors of what constituted cyberbullying as some kind of anchor for respondents to deal with tangible forms of cyberbullying, because it's a complex concept. It's kind of in flux and people use it differently. For example, one of those 6 behaviors was 32% of the respondents, over 1,000 respondents from the US, said that they were the targets of offensive name calling in public forums. However, when one does the kind of study where they go and look at the frequency of these things, the numbers tend to look a bit different. And of course, these things don't have to be in contradiction, but there seems to be something of a perception of a mismatch, at least. So there are studies like by Meiti Tabawada and Gardner et al., a study that I'll come back to in just a moment, which looked specifically at a Guardian context, that suggests somewhere between 2 and 20% of comments or posts or entries, it depends which digital genre one is looking at, for which of those terms is more suitable, happen. So like that's where incivility happens, in a sort of low number of posts or low number of comments. In a newsreader context, journalists often identify incivility in reader comments as a problem and as a concern for their work and for the challenges associated with their work. So for example, they express that it's a concern for them that they might lose important sources and contacts close to them if their work is kind of judged critically by commenters. And then to come back to the Gardner et al. Piece, which was a study actually commissioned by The Guardian in 2016, where they wanted to look at incivility in their online spaces. They found that it was female and ethnic minority writers in The Guardian who were receiving the most hateful comments. So the focus of Gardner et al. Study was on incivility directed to the journalists writing for the organization. So they looked at things like the demographic makeup of the different journalists, and it was female and ethnic minority groups, journalists who were in the top 10. And they also looked at sort of spaces on the Guardian's website where comments occurred, and the environment was one that was fairly high up. Okay, so it's a quick kind of literature review and extremely a snapshot, obviously, of work done on incivility and communication in digital spaces. There is a lot more written, you can guess, but to provide some context for what I'm going to present. I want to say a little bit more about online newsreader comments and work done on them, on what they are, before I tell you about the corpus as a whole, the data set as a whole that we have created here at the University of Gothenburg, myself and some colleagues, and then begin to describe a few patterns that are in there. I think it's first good to explain what these newsreader comments are in case you don't have any experience with seeing them, perhaps acting yourself as a user who comments on newsreader articles. So online newsreader comments are often termed have your say or below the line. And when below the line is used, it's often in a pejorative sense. So people often say, for example, don't read below the line, meaning don't go down below the article, the news article in question, read the comments, because it's full of sort of like toxic, unconstructive, unhelpful comments. Although we should remember from the work that is done by people like Tabawada just here, actually people's impressions of these things, perhaps because of media discussion of them, and empirical evidence of how proliferate it is or is not, seem to mismatch. The first examples of online news organizations allowing on their websites the opportunity for readers to comment occur in the sort of late 90s and early 2000s. So one in the US, the Rocky Mountain News, which I can't say I've ever been to myself, is cited by Santana in their study as being the first case in point. The Guardian, which is what we're going to look at because it's the data set that I'm analyzing for what I'm presenting today, they first allow comments to their newsreader site in 2007. And this study by Santana studied the top 100, and this was kind of by circulation rate, top 100 newspapers in the US, and found that in 2007, only a third of them allowed reader comments, whereas when we get to 2008, that had suddenly shifted, and in some sense, it was a tipping point, or a tipping point of a different kind, a turning point for this genre, suddenly becoming like the norm for many news organizations, allowing it to their websites. I think why that is itself an interesting conversation. I won't speculate about that now, but maybe we can go there in our Q&A. If you think about financial collapses and people having a say, I think there's lots of interesting things to say about this period of time being such a crucial time when then comments are allowed to many news organizations' websites. Tabawada and her group of collaborators have explored online newsreader comments to quite a significant degree. I would say that she is kind of one of the pioneering people working in this area and working with this genre of text, often in a CAD-based way. And as she and her colleagues convincingly put, these are quite a unique, specific digital genre. They are highly opinionated, highly informationally rich, and sometimes, yes, they have cases of incivility, but they, when done well, contribute significantly to the discussion and the social conversation. This said, they're not without their controversy. So the study that I mentioned earlier on by Gardner et al. Is one example, particularly on the Guardian's news web pages, where they have contributed to the debate around things like harassment and cyberbullying. And this has led to a number of platforms changing the practice of how they allow commenters to comment on newsreader articles on their websites, and in some cases just dropping them entirely. At one point in time, the New York Times, I think it was a brief period of time, they pre-moderated everything before it went onto the website. So they were not allowing any comment there until it had gone through one of their moderators. And a number of websites now, they use, as you can imagine, like semi-automated means of checking whether a certain comment has problematic language in it, is uncivil in some kind of way, it has hate speech or something like this, which pulls on flagging and other things that push it to moderators that then check whether something is there. In terms of their structure, because digital genres obviously do different things to speech and print that was pre-digital or not in a kind of social web context, they're often anchored, and at least the Guardians that we're going to look at, in terms of like two levels. Two levels in the sense that people who reply directly to the news item are judged as sort of giving some comment on that article, typically, and then they allow for like one level of threadedness where somebody who's already posted a reply might have a reply to their comment. And these are often called parent comments when they're at the top level, when they are sort of seen as replies to the article itself, and daughter or child comments when they are a reply to a reply. So it looks something like this, to go to The Guardian. When one goes to The Guardian's climate crisis, is it now? Previously, it was climate change. You can see this just towards the top of the screenshot here. When one goes there, you can see the various articles that are listed in the climate crisis section on The Guardian. And you can see in the case of some of them towards the bottom right here, that they allow comments to that article. Not all comments now on The Guardian do allow comments, but typically the more kind of op-edy stuff does allow comments for users who are going to The Guardian online to comment on the article in question or comment on other commenters' comments on the article. And The Guardian, like or following actually the New York Times, now organizes the presentation of information in this kind of Guardian picks. So the New York Times were the first ones to come up with this, where they wanted to highlight things that they judged, mostly based on manual judgment of moderators, to be good comments that were contributing constructively to the conversation, and highlight that at the top so that when one drops below the line that's at the very top of the page right now, or screen, one sees stuff that the moderators have judged as being kind of good, constructive comments. And then what happens below this is all the comments, including the ones that have been pulled out for picks. This idea, though, of promoting the good stuff is one that has been under quite a lot of discussion, both in kind of discourse analysis perspective. So Taboada's group have worked with this notion of constructiveness, comments that have qualities in the language that are well pressed to suggest that this is a positive contribution to the discussion. And also in the like HCI, human computer interaction tradition, designing interfaces that allow things like this, promote the good stuff is an increasing discussion. So when we move down the page to the stuff that's in the second right red block, sorry, you can begin to see the two levels here. So the comment that is at the top is a parent comment, judged often, typically, as being a reply to the article. And then what happens below it by Kim1540 is a reply, and you can see this in terms of the meta text at the top, to the parent comment in question. But we don't get more threadedness than this. So one doesn't get, or the Guardian's website doesn't allow replies to replies to replies, if that makes sense. So it only allows one level in. Of course, that is possible by kind of atting and doing those other features. Okay, so myself and some of my colleagues, and I must particularly mention one of my colleagues, William Hedley Thompson, who's done all the programming and all the scripting and all the technical stuff that I can't do. But I sort of drew up a wish list and told him how it wasn't correct at various points in time, and we went through several iterations of this. We decided that it was good to build this data set of reader comments posted on climate change articles on The Guardian. It is all online newsreader comments of the period of 2007, when The Guardian first started allowing comments to their website, up until halfway through last year, on the roughly 4,300 articles that are posted on The Guardian's current climate crisis, previously climate change. Guardian changed their language a few years ago to change their terms, so now they go with climate crisis rather than climate change. But it's all the articles that were taken from the now climate crisis, previously climate change section of The Guardian's website. It is in size a little over 77 million words. And I won't be able to answer technical details of this, although I think William is in the office around the corner. So maybe I can drag him in to do this if there are questions about the technicalities. But it was done with Python and using Beautiful Soup and Selenium. And what we ripped out were all the textual comments, all the written language, and all the significant, in our judgment, metadata. So things like timestamps, things like the threadedness, things like the usernames, and so on and so forth. So all that data we have. Now, for the things that I want to present on today, and for sort of ongoing work, what we then did was extract a sub-corpus from this wider corpus. So the wider corpus is this 77 million word comments corpus of all comments posted on the Guardian's website for climate change articles. And what I want to talk about in the time that remains is a subset of this corpus, which is all comments. So like first level of threadedness comments in Judge Denner's replies to the news article itself, where one or more of the replies, this is kind of the daughter comments, are blocked out by the Guardian's moderators. So just to explain that again, because it's difficult to keep one's head around it or get one's head around it. This data set that we've taken is all comments, so parent level comments that have one or more replies, daughter comments, which the Guardian's moderators blocked out. And it's around about 750,000 words. It's around about 8,500 comments. And then we wanted to make a comparison corpus of randomly pulled comments where there were no blocked comments received in reply. So we pulled a random sample of parent comments where there were no blocked replies to that comment. And it's a slightly bigger corpus. We were aiming something that was sort of very exact, but because the first corpus, the blocked corpus, as I'm going to call it, or blocked comments corpus, had a number of duplicates in it because it had one or more, it had more than one reply that was blocked out. We had to get rid of those duplicates and just focus on the original comments or the individual comments. And this meant we ended up with a slightly smaller corpus of the blocked comments. Now, the question that we're asking in this part of our work on this data set is there something in the language of people who receive replies that end up getting blocked out that typifies them as being somehow different? And there's many ways of thinking about this. Is it language that pushes other people's buttons? Is it language that attracts trolls? Is it language that in some other way brings about replies to it that is uncivil? And this is obviously not super great because we're using, not problem free, because we're using the Guardian's judgment to moderate out comments as being a kind of proxy for somehow uncivil or problematic language. And we don't know because we don't have that data. And it's ethically, there's a question of whether we should go and get that data, which I think is important to reflect on. Technically, it's also pretty difficult to go and recover that data, near impossible. It rests with the Guardian for good reasons. So we don't know in all cases what that uncivil language looks like, or that indeed it is uncivil, but in the judgment of the Guardian's eyes, it was problematic. And therefore, we're going to make the assumption that the first subcorpus or first slice of the corpus that we have under bullet point 1 here somehow contains language that is like problematic. And what's going to be given on the following slides are just a few, which is good because I don't have super loads more time. Time always goes quicker than you imagine. A few kind of initial observations about some, in some cases apparent, and in other cases fairly subtle, but we still think meaningful differences between these two data sets. Data set 1, where we've got comments that has received attracted uncivil replies. Data set 2, no uncivil replies. Sorry for the color switch very suddenly. I didn't have a chance to change this into my more reasonable or modest or boring, I don't know, white and blue when I first came to Sweden. This is actually a joke, but it's a joke I like to tell the students. I thought that this kind of blue and yellow integrated me well into being in Sweden, but it turns out the students didn't like it anyway. So in the next slides are some observations of differences in frequency of certain verbs that are in these two corpus, the block comments corpus and the no blocks corpus. And what I want to focus on is something that within Hallidaean linguistics is called the mental and the verbal verbs. So verbs that are to do with communication in the case of verbal, and verbs that are to do with stuff that sort of happens inside the head or inside the body that are somehow kind of like inner or within, rather than outwardly visible actions, the kind of prototypical doing verbs. And in Hallidaean linguistics, sort of counter Chomskyan ideas, there isn't incidental small syntax semantics overlap in Chomsky's terms. For Halliday and those working within SFL, there is an organic relationship here, such that the grammatical potential of different groups of verbs based on meaning is different. So something that mental and verbal verbs allow for, that material and relational ones don't, is the ability to have, let's put it like that, like this, object clauses. So clauses themselves as the object of the verb. Okay, so in terms of the verbal verbs, the communicative verbs, what we see here are the most frequent verbs in the two corpora and their relative frequency, the blocked comments corpus and the no blocked replies corpus, where there is a notable difference about their frequency. Most of the verbs that are there in the two corpora at the top, the most frequent verbs, are very, very similar in terms of their relative frequency. They're very, very similar. But there's a few that stand out as being somewhat different. And here I give you the verbs that are skewed in the favor of the blocked corpus. So these occur notably more in the blocked replies corpus than in the no blocks corpus. And they are tell, blame, write, deny, suggest, and claim. And their relative frequency for the blocked replies corpus is in the middle column here. And in the comparative corpus, the no blocked replies corpus, their relative frequency is again given per million words, given that the data set sizes are slightly different. So these ones are more frequent, and I think importantly so, in the blocked replies corpus. For example, when one goes into the concordance lines and starts to think about what other patterns are there, blame is kind of notable because we get instances of like imperative or imperative-like structures where blame is used in a negative context in the blocked replies corpus, and it doesn't occur anywhere near as frequently, that kind of construction, in the no blocked replies corpus. So in the blocked replies corpus, you get things like, now I can't quite see it because I've got something hanging over that part of my slides. You get things like, don't blame it on advertisements. You can't blame the companies for looking to make money. Stop blaming the Democrats, and so on and so forth. These two examples as well, deny and claim, which are notably more salient as verbs of communication in the blocked replies corpus, I think are interesting to reflect on in terms of stance taking. So here I flip to a sort of summary of Martin and White's appraisal theory, and particularly within appraisal theory, a subsystem called engagement, which fundamentally is about monoglossia and heteroglossia. So this goes back to Voloshinov and Bakhtin's ideas on polyphony and heteroglossia. The idea that when we talk, we orient our contribution to contributions of others. If we think about deny and claim, they're pretty important in terms of what Martin and White theorize as heteroglossive contractive statements of the deny type, denying something is the case, and a subtype of expansive types of heteroglossic move that they call distance, where one kind of relates to the thing that's being said, but at a distance. And often scare quotes are used in this way because we don't want to take them on ourselves, but we want to kind of distance them and put them in the mouths of somebody else and make it clear it's not us who's saying this. Communicative verbs that skew in favor of the no blocked replies corpus are slightly different in tone, I think. So these are the ones that are typical in the corpus where we have comments that don't receive blocked replies. They are ask, agree, and address, and their relative frequency, again, per million words. So we have normalized frequencies are bigger in the no blocked corpus here than in the blocked corpus. And one observation when going in to read the concordance lines, there are many, I don't have time to go over them all, is that yourself is quite a strong right colloquy, so after the verb in question in the no blocked replies than in the blocked replies comment. So ask yourself why permafrost is melting. Larry, ask yourself, why didn't you know about climate change in 1989? Which is quite interesting because there seems to be potentially, when one reads through these, something a little bit strong about these, which we might think, why doesn't that attract replies that leads to being moderated out? Very quickly, because I appreciate I'm running low on time, in terms of the verbs then in Hallidayan transitivity, descriptive framework that are to do with things that are like inside the body, mental verbs, ones that are skewed in favor of blocked replies see, want, believe, understand, care, ignore, and hope. And I think interestingly, their subtypes, desideratives, ones that are about desiring other things, and their grammar is different from other subtypes of mental, appear quite high up here. So we get things like want, skewed in favor of blocked replies, care, the same, hope, the same, these kind of desiring verbs. Whereas the kind of mental verbs that we get in the no blocked replies corpus are things like, expect, remember, and wonder, primarily ones of cognition that then kind of reside in the head, where mental, I guess, is a particularly good label for. And there's a notable difference between the subjects of these ones. So in the no block corpus, first person subject is stronger than in the blocked corpus, so more use of I, liking, I like, I expect, I remember, not so salient in the blocked corpus, whereas the other way around when we look at the two corpora. So when it is you, it is more typical in the blocked corpus. When it's you like, you expect, you remember, you wonder, and that is less frequent in the no blocked corpus, which I think sort of makes sense and tells us that to talk about oneself and what one believes, remembers, wonders, expects themselves is kind of okay. But if you start talking about those things for others, it might be more likely to attract replies that are less civil. And then a final slide, because I think I should make sure that we have some time for discussion. On sort of impolite language. And this is a fairly obvious but simple finding that we have extracted from working with this corpus and its two slices that I described earlier on, but an important one. So we did a keygrams analysis where we didn't find super much. Keygrams are basically words that are keywords. They occur in this corpus particularly saliently, whereas in a comparative corpus, they don't occur anywhere near as much. So there's something special about their use in the corpus under study. And when it's keygrams rather than keywords, it's word combinations, basically. So we were finding things like RFAQs, moderator because, community standards as key 2 grams that were very high up the list. But it was super obvious why this was the case, because what we had were things like this, where somebody's comment had been deleted out. This comment was removed by a moderator because it didn't abide by our community standards. Replies may also be deleted. For more detail, see our FAQs. And what does this mean? This means that something that was salient in the blocked replies corpus was that many of the comments themselves had been blocked out by the Guardian. Whereas in our random sample corpus, not one, and we took it purely at random, not one of the parent comments had been removed, had been blocked out. But in the comments where there were blocked replies in reply, 89 of them were removed, which is a pretty important finding, I think. And it tells us that, as a nice way of wrapping up, Some of what is in this data is itself uncivil. So we get people who are using language in a less constructive way, and that itself tracks incivility. However, that's only one thing that's going on. People who received replies that get moderated out, and therefore that we assume in some way or another are uncivil. Plenty of them are like abiding by the community standards. They are playing by the rules. And then the question we want to continue to explore is there something in their language in terms of stance taking, in terms of mental and verbal verbs, mental and communicative verbs that indicate what is going on there and why they might have received uncivil replies. Okay, thanks.
Ben, thanks very much indeed for a very thorough talk. Yeah, excellent. I'm going to stop recording before we go into